Okay. Welcome everybody who is joining us in the virtual world. We are here at the Watershed Institute at the 5th Annual Watershed Conference. And we are gathering here for our second session during the conference on vacant lots. What does a comfortable, clean, and green community look like, and how do we get there? Please feel free to put your name in the chat and where you're joining from. And if you've already thought of any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I am going to start with our land acknowledgement, which we are doing prior to each session. We recognize that the land and water now under our care is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape. We pay respect to Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We respect their knowledge, culture, and tradition, which have contributed to the conservation of land and water. We also acknowledge prior to this session that historic white supremacy and environmental racism practices have caused disproportionate environmental and climate impacts on people of color and overburdened communities. The Watershed Institute pledges to work for clean water and a healthy environment, including in communities that have been unjustly affected by systemic racism and environmental pollution. We would also like to extend a special thanks to our 5th Annual Watershed Conference sponsors, Trent Hydro, the Capicon Foundation, and the Musconetcon Watershed Association. And with that, we will get started. I am going to introduce Alex Rivera, who to most of you, I'm sure, needs no introduction. Alex is with the Mercer County Parks Commission. He's got a robust background in economic development, as well as a wonderful knowledge of green infrastructure and environmental policy, and two sessions were his brainchild, and we are really happy to have him here moderate. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I do want to recognize the Watershed Institute's help in helping me get this session together. Sophie and Pri specifically, but others in this room have also contributed knowingly or unknowingly to this idea. And I will call on those people, even though they don't know I'm going to call on them. All right, so I want to give our two primary speakers a chance to introduce themselves. So Leah, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Leah Yasenhcak. I am an environmental planner. I'm a principal at BRS. We are a environmental planning and engineering consulting firm. And we do a lot of work, particularly in urban areas, from anything from grant writing, grant management, project management, park development, resiliency projects, resiliency planning, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Leah. Caitlin, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Caitlin Fair. I'm the program director for the East Trenton Collaborative, which is a community organizing initiative based in the East Trenton neighborhood of the North Ward of the city of Trenton.
Thank you, Caitlin. All right, I'm going to set the context again if you were not present for the first session. So we are presenting nature as a tool to solve community challenges, whether that be public health, economic development, workforce development. We feel that nature has a role in addressing those challenges. We're going to define urban. Urban, for the purposes of this session, means areas of high impervious cover, limited natural features, high population density, and communities of people who are historically excluded from power processes. The definition of green infrastructure for the purposes of this session is all natural features and processes that influence community function. And if you are familiar with the Baltimore ecosystem study, that definition will be familiar to you. I also want to make clear that this investment in many urban neighborhoods is an environmental justice issue directly connected to climate change and communities' ability to be prepared economically, in public health, and in social justice for the changes that will come because of climate change. All right, so this is gonna be an open discussion. Like I said, there are members of the audience who I may call on, but we're gonna start with the people who know that they're speaking. Leah, I'm gonna direct the first question to you, but this is an open conversation. So Caitlin, if you have anything to say about a question that's directed to Leah or something that she says, you are welcome to jump in. And for the audience, if you could raise your hand or answer any questions in the chat, you are welcome to do that. All right, Leah, one of the reasons we wanted you to be here is because you have done a lot of brownfield redevelopment. So we were kind of thinking about the idea of a vacant lot as an undesirable space, and brownfields are also undesirable spaces. So can you kind of draw, what are the challenges that you face when redeveloping brownfields, and how do you think they are different or similar or dissimilar to general vacant lot redevelopment?
So for those who maybe aren't familiar with the term brownfield is a property that has that is either undeveloped or underdeveloped because of real or perceived contamination. So very frequently brownfields are vacant lots. They're former industrial sites, typically that have contamination in the soil and or the groundwater. So it's essentially boils down to a more complicated real estate transaction where there is another process that needs to be folded into the regular redevelopment process when you're dealing with contamination, which of course increases the uncertainty for developers as well as the cost for developers. So in terms of, its parallels with redeveloping vacant lots in general, I think anytime you are faced with a vacant lot, particularly in an urban area, you need to assume that there may very well be contamination and at least do a preliminary assessment to determine whether that's something that needs to be explored further. When you're developing a vacant lot for an open space reuse, whether it be green infrastructure or a park or community gardens or green space, you need to make sure that the contamination isn't present in a way that it could interact with the public. So you need to make sure that it is tested, capped, or otherwise, there's no pathway for exposure.
Thank you, Leah. Some of the comments you made, I want to direct a question to Caitlin. Caitlin, do you deal with brownfields in the East Trenton Collaborative area? I know the answer is yes, but what's going on with those? How do residents relate to them? What have you seen be successful and what have you seen not be successful?
I was going to say no, not at all. So for those who are not familiar with the East Trenton neighborhood, I think a little bit of context here is important in regards to this question. So the East Trenton neighborhood is one of the most, and historically was one of the most heavily industrialized neighborhoods in Trenton and in the general, in New Jersey. It was the kind of hub of industry at one point historically, particularly when during the Industrial Revolution, when there were no real parameters around industry and no real understanding of the impacts of a lot of the processes that were happening at the time. And so we still to this day are dealing with a lot of the impacts of industry from, very long ago, and as well as the current industry that still exists in the neighborhood, because it still is a mixed industrial and residential neighborhood. So there's still a great deal of industrial activity in the neighborhood that currently impacts residents. So we both have the historical impact of industry as well as the current impact of industry that impact our environment in the neighborhood in a multitude of different ways. So it's a very complicated situation. We have a ton of brownfield sites in our neighborhood. Probably currently most famously is the Antico Square site, which has been a long process of trying to figure out how to both remediate that site and then what to do with it. So there are a lot of different ways that you can deal with brownfield sites. One of the ways is by just capping them. However, that comes with its own challenges. So capping them essentially just means just covering them up with a non-permeable something like concrete and not having anything that would allow for potential contaminants to seep out of what is under there. But of course, that would mean that we would just be paving over a lot of different large sites in these various places where you have a large number or large volume of brownfield sites. And these sites tend to be pretty big as well, because you're talking about places where there used to be potteries or large manufacturing places. And so that obviously is not necessarily beneficial to these neighborhoods either, because then you're talking about increasing heat islands and decreasing green infrastructure. So when you're looking at a neighborhood like East Trenton in particular, it's really important to take into account all of the different sites like this and how they interact with one another when you're deciding how you want to approach remediating them, because you can't just do the same thing for all of them, or you're going to create additional issues for yourself down the line. So going back to the Amtico Square site as an example of this, that is one of the sites where capping it was suggested as the way to remediate that particular site. But the residents and other folks in the city came up with a really cool idea to turn it into some outdoor recreational space and create a skate park in that area, which would increase the amount of outdoor recreational space that's available in the neighborhood, which is something that the residents are really adamant about. And the great thing about it is it has been incorporated into a plan to increase some other green infrastructure around that particular site, which I think is really important, because I think if we were talking about just putting in the skate park by itself and just increasing the amount of hard top surface in the neighborhood, we would, as I said, kind of exacerbate some other issues that the neighborhood faces but by incorporating that into a larger plan to create a greenway through that area and implement some other outdoor green infrastructure. It's a more comprehensive plan that allows us to think, I think, be more forward thinking about the impacts of how we deal with those sites.
To jump in on that, I'm actually really familiar with the Amtico Square site in the Yasenhcak Greenway. I'm the project manager on behalf of the city of Trenton for that 99 acre or so greenway. And the city's been working toward that for a number of years. Isles just, I guess, last year, 2 years ago, completed a wonderful area-wide study of the brownfields there in that neighborhood, and through an EPA grant, and got a lot of community input on the design, which is terrific. But Caitlin, you mentioned that capping is impervious surface, and I just want to highlight that it can be impervious surface, but it also can be pervious surface. It's just a instead of 6 inches of concrete, it would be 2 feet of soil. So you can leave contaminants, depending on the type of contaminants. You can, in certain cases, leave contaminants in place with a suitable soil barrier. So it's not, it doesn't have to be paved over. And we are actually doing that on many of the sites in the Yasenhcak Greenway. One of the challenges there is that the sites are along the creek, and so many of them are in the floodway. And so you're not allowed to bring material into the floodway and increase the fill there. You have to take material out in order to bring clean material in, which of course increases the cost of the project. For the Amtico Square site specifically, a large building was demolished and the concrete slab of the basement remains in place and it is acting as a cap. And so we'll be able to build the skate park on top of that existing cap without increasing the impervious surface in the neighborhood. So it was a really great location for that particular use.
Well, thank you both for introducing Amtico Square and kind of introducing the idea of this kind of network, right? So we're talking about the Aspenine Greenway, and in our session before, we talked about vacant lots as a network, and you kind of want to view them as a cohort. Jim Simon from Isles and Julia Taylor from Trent Health Team were talking about that yesterday. So I'm going to call out somebody who I know is in the audience. If you don't want to talk about this, that's fine. Jay Watson, I really want to talk about the community engagement process around Capital City Farm and how you and the partners, one of which was me, thought about the development of Capital City Farm in relation to the plans for the Aspenine Greenway and any other development that was going on. So Jay, are you willing to talk about that a little bit?
I guess so, since you put me on the spot.
She's always willing to talk about Capital City Farm.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say that thank you for holding this forum. I mean, I think this topic is so very important across New Jersey. And I have to say, every time I go down to Capital City Farm right now, my spirit soars every time I'm there because it's everything that I thought it could be. And with the exception of more community engagement down on the property, as Leah knows, and Alex, of course, you know, because you were there from the beginning, Capital City Farm does sit on 2 acres right next to the Trenton Area Soup Kitchen in East Trenton, and it is on an institutional control cap because it was considered historic fill, because much of the old vibrant neighborhood that was once there was pushed into the cut where the rail line once was. But very early on in this project, I mean, when we were assembling the land to create this project, I mean, we were coming up with designs on what the farm should look like. And then when we started assembling people from the community and others that could kind of give us guidance on this project, they basically said, you know, pull up the reins, pull back on this horse a little bit, and let's go talk to the community before we start designing. I mean, I come from a landscape design and landscape architecture and horticultural background, so I was ready to just start designing stuff and kind of like getting ready to put things in place. But then we were wisely counseled to just pull back on, you know, on any plans that we had and make sure that we dive into the neighborhood to see what the neighborhood really wants to see happen down in that space. And so there was a long, you know, a very productive effort walking the streets in East Trenton, and Jim Simon knows, he was, you know, with us from the beginning as well. And we've had some interaction with Caitlin and East Trenton Collaborative to just let people know that this kind of is a blank slate and to see, you know, what they thought should happen out there. Now, I had to say, while we're very happy with the operations now at the park, the Mercer County Park Commission has taken it over as kind of an adjunct to the Howe Living History Farm. So they teach living agricultural history at Howe Farm and Hopewell, and now they can teach about the future of agriculture in Trenton, right next to the soup kitchen, which kind of makes us very excited about the possibilities. And so we have a great operational structure in place. There's a young person of color that's the farm manager there that we recruited to the space, who was awesome, Logan Davis. And but I do think that we still need to do a better job of making sure the community knows who we are, what we are, and those things are, you know, ahead of us, right? We have to make sure that the community gets full benefit out of that space. So I probably went on longer than you wanted, Alex, but I'll leave it there.
That's all right, Jay. Thank you so much for that context. I do want to jump a little bit more into community engagement, because I think that as I was envisioning this session, I'm thinking about the number of vacant lots. And just because of the place that I'm in my life and my career, I'm like, yeah, let's turn all that into forest and it's going to be great. But, you know, in reality, right, there are recreational uses that the community needs, like Caitlin and Leah talked to. And the lot that is now Capital City Farm was, I think it was a vacant lot, there was a lot of dumping going on, and Jay really championed the redevelopment of that. So I kind of want to ask a general question that, you know, my panelists, other people in the audience can jump into. The idea that we're trying to emphasize here is that a lot can also be converted into like a microforest on a more permanent basis or a meadow on a temporary basis. So I'm kind of looking for feedback. Maybe Caitlin, I want to start with you. When residents think about vacant lots and talk about vacant lots with you, what are kind of all the possibilities that people think of and bring up to you?
Well, I think it depends on both the resident and the position of the lot. So a couple of things that come up frequently in our neighborhood, specifically as a medium to high density residential neighborhood, are things like parking issues for residents, the desire for extended outdoor space for people's homes. So one of the things that we hear often is we have residents who come to us who are looking to acquire the adjacent lot to their property to do something like build out a patio or add off-street parking, or start a garden. We currently have a resident who recently purchased a home in the neighborhood that is adjacent to an undersized lot, who's looking to acquire that lot to create a garden. He's a gardener. And some of those uses we think are very functional because so part of the issue with developing these lots is that someone has to be responsible for them, right? At least to some capacity. And so if you're taking a lot and you're kind of developing it just within the context of that development and there is no one kind of assigned to it or responsible for it, oftentimes what happens is they become nuisances in some capacity later on down the line. But if you are having residents who are acquiring lots that are adjacent to their properties for their own personal use for responsible uses, who are going to maintain them, you now have a person who is built in, who is responsible for maintaining that. And oftentimes those folks are really good stewards of those parcels because it's a part of their home. And if they have the wherewithal and desire to acquire it, oftentimes, you know, that's a motivation for them to keep it up as well. Now, the other side of that coin is sometimes you have folks in the neighborhood who run different types of businesses or endeavors out of their homes who are looking to acquire space near their homes to support those kinds of things, which can end up becoming nuisances. So we have some folks in the neighborhood who fix up cars or other types of machinery, and they're looking to acquire property near their houses to store vehicles and machinery that end up being nuisances to the neighborhood and to the neighbors. And so those things aren't necessarily permitted uses. However, they happen, right? So when you're exploring the possibility of conveying these spaces to residents to develop on their own, it's a balance, I think, between what the intended use is for that person and what the responsibility of that person is going to be to maintain it. As far as doing things like meadows and forests and stuff, I love the idea of that. But again, oftentimes, especially in neighborhoods like East Trenton, what happens is people see spaces like that, they assume that they are not being monitored and they become dumping grounds. And that is a really big issue in East Trenton specifically and other neighborhoods like East Trenton, because people from outside have the impression that these spaces are not being monitored. And often they're not in a lot of cases, depending on who the steward of that particular parcel is. So that oftentimes becomes more of a nuisance than if you have a lot that appears to be having some type of active something happening on it and that's actively being monitored or used in a particular capacity. So one of the things ETC is looking to do as kind of a trial, maybe a little bit similarly to what was done at Capital City Farm, is to take some of the lots. So we're working directly with the city. We were brought in brought in as a partner with the city on this project to do a trial initiative to start some type of semi-permanent green infrastructure and community garden in a few of the adjacent vacant lots. So what we're looking to do is build a greenhouse and do some trial hydroponics gardening and bring in between, so ETC has a youth employment program, as does the city. And so we're looking to utilize those programs to train some youth in urban agriculture and have them be stewards of this space. To try to look at some alternative uses for these various different lots where they can be also actively providing another benefit to the community outside of just not being a nuisance or not being a site where you're going to end up with illegal dumping or other kinds of illicit activities.
Caitlin, you said a lot of stuff that I want to talk more about. One of the things I want to highlight really quickly is that, you know, these environmental investments that East Trenton Collaborative, the city of Trenton, and ETC's partners are making are workforce development things, right? So this is one of the points that I want everybody here to understand, that when you are making environmental investments in your neighborhood, there's social benefit, there's environmental benefit, and as a society, we do very poorly at capturing and valuing those types of benefits. But here directly, there's an economic benefit. So I want to make sure that people understand that, and that when we're talking about nature-based solutions, the job development part is definitely part of that. Leah, I want to ask you a little bit about the policy context for, let me think about what I want to say. The policy context for brownfield and vacant lot redevelopment, both at a state and local level. I know that that's a big question, but what are a couple things you think could be better about the state and local environment around redevelopment that could kind of facilitate these types of opportunities?
You mean specifically for redevelopment to open space or conservation type of uses, or just in general?
Let's start with conservation type of uses, but then also in general.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that concerns me as representing municipalities is that oftentimes the neighborhood or the city are interested in developing vacant lots as an interim use. And because of the way that the Green Acres regulations are written, oftentimes there's a reluctance to do that because it could restrict any future development. Because if a lot is developed as a pocket park or as just an open space area, and the city wants to later develop it for housing or jobs or something like that, then it can be restricted. So it can no longer be used for that. So I think that there's a lack of understanding among some municipalities as to how to manage that conflict, and really by passing a resolution stating that that this is an interim use. If you're leasing it to a community organization such as ISLES to do community gardening on, it just needs to be very clear that it's not a permanent use. So that I think is a policy area that is rife with miscommunication, and cities are worried about backing themselves into a corner with that. In terms of just in general, I would say with brownfields, the brownfields process has been very well developed in New Jersey. It's a very well understood process. It is working, fairly predictably now. You know what process you need to go through in order to get to a remedial action outcome. The system has been privatized, so we no longer have the big backlogs that we used to have with DEP. That said, I think one of the big issues still facing redevelopment, particularly in urban areas of vacant lots, is the historic fill restrictions. Because in order to redevelop, in order to get a remedial action outcome, you know, a clean letter, you need to show that there are no exceedances, or that a site is capped, and in reality, the whole entire neighborhood has the same type of contamination ubiquitous throughout the neighborhood. So you have a little clean hole in your donut, and it can be quite expensive. So I think that that is something that, you know, would benefit the state to have a look at that policy.
Thank you, Leah. I want to go back a little bit to what Caitlin was saying about, you know, spaces that are supposed to have temporary or permanent conservation uses, and then people seeing that as kind of like an open space to have undesirable activities. So, Caitlin, what do you think the design of a space needs to look like in order to make sure that that doesn't happen?
I think that there are, so I think design is important. I also think that there are other aspects of that are important that there tend to be a disconnect with. So as far as design is concerned, someone in the chat mentioned signage as a potential support to try to maintain those spaces and not have them be used for purposes other than what they're intended for. I do think that to some degree signage can help because it is an indicator to an extent that this space is being monitored to some capacity. But even if you came to East Trenton and you looked at our parks, which are used spaces, that signage and spaces being actively used doesn't always stop people from doing things that they shouldn't do, or not upholding the spaces as they should be upheld, particularly if they're not what we call like neighborhood witnesses, right? So I think our expertise as far as ETC is concerned is resident organizing, right? We are not environmentalists. We are not any of these things. We are community organizers. And we're not, you know, design specialists either. But what we do know is that the more organized that a community is, the more likely you will have positive outcomes in any capacity. So I think part of what we see happening with spaces like this sometimes is that you have entities that are not directly partnering with the community and have residents in the neighborhood who understand and know and are aware of and informed about what's happening and what the intention of certain spaces are. And they just come in and do things. And without the buy-in of the residents and the people who live in that area, if they don't know what's happening or they don't know what the intention of a space is, they're not able to properly serve as stewards of that space. Right. So I think part of what is really important is ensuring that these different agencies and entities have active and significant partnerships within the communities that they're trying to work in, and not just with other agencies and organizations, but with actual people in the community. And I think we depend very heavily on our relationships with other agencies and organizations. And to a great extent, they're wonderful. Like we have, one of the things that I really love about what ETC is able to do with their environmental community organizing committee is that we have a representative from DEP. We have Jamila Harris, who comes to almost every one of our meetings with the community and talks directly with our community residents about the things that they're doing, about finding out what the needs are of the community, what the issues and concerns are. And she finds answers to those things and she comes back and she reports on them, and we're able to really get a lot accomplished in that way. And so I think if we had Alex has done a great job of this too, in terms of activities that the county is trying to do in our particular neighborhood, where he has come and presented at community meetings. And we have residents who now, for example, they just landscaped a part of George Page Park, and we had residents who were out there, including some of our kids who are involved with ETC, actually doing the planting and working on this space. And so I can just about guarantee now that those folks who participated in that process and know what is happening in that space are going to be good stewards of that space and ensure that people are not doing something that's going to be detrimental to its maintenance, right? So I think sometimes we are overly dependent on our connections with other agencies and organizations and the people who work in those spaces who aren't necessarily directly like living in the neighborhoods that things are happening in. And yes, we should connect with those people, but beyond, we have to take that a step further and connect with the folks that this is directly impacting and who are directly connected to that physically and geographically. Because when they have buy-in, then it's much easier to ensure that they're going to be stewards of those spaces and make sure that things that shouldn't be happening in those spaces are not happening.
Thanks for kind of fleshing that out a little bit, Caitlin. I definitely agree that, I am among those people who's really reliant on my relationships with organizations rather than people who are actually living in the neighborhood. Jay, I'm gonna ask you to talk about something, but not quite yet. I want to ask you about the community engagement process for Capital City Farm and its focus on redlining, because I think that hits a lot of the points that Caitlin is talking about. But Leah, Brownfield redevelopment kind of has some of those same community engagement issues, and you really need to be on top of it because it's kind of a flashpoint. What have you seen work really well in terms of community engagement that made a project successful in the long term? And what have you seen not work that really ended up hurting a project?
Well, I think, part of the problem with Brownfields development and engaging with the community is a couple of things. One is oftentimes it's a really long timeline to get from, vision to actual ribbon cutting, just because it's especially if it's being funded through public money and there's grant timelines involved, it can take many years. So I think establishing clear expectations with the community when you first reach out to them and say, we're going to address, I had my first community meeting in the East Trenton neighborhood in 1999 about the Eskin Greenway. And it's just now that we're actually starting to show some difference. So, those people who came and said, I want a playground for my toddler, well, they're grandparents now, so just kind of making sure that the community understands the process and the timelines that are likely to be involved. And I would say the thing that has worked best is partnering with organizations like IELTS, because I can't say enough about how great the East Trenton Collaborative outreach and the work done through the area-wide plan has been, because it's the organizations such as IELTS that have the relationships, and the East Trenton Collaborative that have the relationships within the community and able to hold events where they can reach people where they are and get real input on reuse decisions. One of the things that EPA, as a funder of a lot of our programs, and DEP2, they really want the community involved in the cleanup decisions. And there's really only a limited amount of input that the community is able to have in the cleanup decisions, because it's based on the actual contaminants and the science and the reuse. Where the community input is very valuable, I think, is in the reuse. And then I would just say the last thing with regard to that is sort of risk communication and making sure that the residents understand what contaminants are there, what the exposure pathways are, and how safe or not safe the site is, because obviously it can be a a real area of concern. And oftentimes there are no readily accessible exposure pathways, and it isn't something, especially in Trenton, nobody's drinking the groundwater. So it's not something that needs to be a huge concern to the community as long as they're not actively playing in on the site. So just being very clear with the risk communication and not frightening people, I think is important too.
Thank you, Leah. I'm gonna take a stab at talking about community engagement for Capital City Farms with Jay's probably like, why does Alex keep doing this to me? But if you have anything to add after I'm done, Jay, just let me know. So long story short, on community engagement for Capital City Farm, a lot of it was rooted in acknowledging the history of redlining and what's the neighborhood name? All right.
In East Trenton?
Yeah,
Ironbound,
don't worry about it.
You're thinking of New York.
No.
Oldport, yeah.
Oldport, yeah.
I was thinking of Newark, I'm so sorry, Coalport. So, it was, a lot of it was grounded in recognizing the history of redlining there, right? So kind of taking that step where you're just coming at it from, we know that historically institutions such as, those who are kind of around the table, are part of the disinvestment of this neighborhood. And this is kind of one of the steps that we want to take to address that, disinvestment. And I think putting it that way was a real game changer, at least for me. And I think that a lot of residents really enjoyed learning about that process. I remember a lot of people would come to these, we held these sessions that were open to the public and not necessarily really institutionally focused. And I think that changed a little bit the type of person who engaged, but there were people who would come and kind of talk about the history of the neighborhood, because, with the redlining, you're presenting the history of the neighborhood. And I thought that was a really great way to approach community engagement, being honest about the history of a place, talking about urban renewal when that was kind of the big idea in planning. I thought that was really successful. And Alexis, I wanted to talk about this. Alexis, who's in the audience, virtual audience, I saw your question, and that's what made me think about it. So I think the redlining approach was really great. Jay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, thank you for reminding me of that, Alex. And first I want to say, I neglected to say that Sophie Glovier, who's sitting at your table, is the one who brought this project, the Capital City Farm project, to our attention in the first place. So thank you, Sophie, for doing that. And I hope to get you down there soon to see how successful it is. But you're right, through an organization called Designing the We, a woman named April DeSimone, she created this exhibit that's been traveling kind of nationally called Undesigned the Red Line. And it was housed in the Conservatory Mansion on East State Street in Trenton for some time. I believe it's still there. But it's served as a jumping off point about these discussions, about what we can do in communities. It showed people the kind of historic racist policies that led to the degradation of their neighborhoods through this historic redlining. And a lot of people never even recognized it. So they look around and see that their neighborhood is, not the best, in the best condition. And there are reasons for that. And it was because of these kind of racist redlining processes that kept investments out of those neighborhoods. And so the Designing the We exhibit and the discussions we had with the community was around how reinvestments in these communities, like Capital City Farm, projects like this can start undesigning those historic red lines and bring investment back into the neighborhoods in a way that doesn't displace the people that are living in those neighborhoods currently. So thanks for mentioning that, Alex. I think it was a very good, important point.
Thank you, Jay. Jim Simon, I'm gonna pick on you now. I'm so sorry, but I wanted to ask you, because you were at the session yesterday, kind of about all of the different approaches to adopt a lot programs. And I know that you have extensive experience working with the city to kind of establish community gardens on open space, and maybe not open space, but on vacant lots. You can tell me if I'm wrong on that. But one of the things I've thought a lot about when it comes to nature-based vacant lot redevelopment is that a lot of people want to have community gardens, and I understand the desire for that, but it's an intensive use, as it's a lot to upkeep. It's a lot of work on aisles. it's not something you can really do with volunteers. So one, what are your thoughts about the adopt a lot approaches that you're familiar with and what may or may not work in the city of Trenton? And two, do you think that a more intensive natural use that may exclude kind of like park-based use, but may include more being involved in terms of the stewardship of land, do you think that approach would work out?
Thanks, Alex. That's a lot of questions there.
I tend to do that.
So talking about a few different strategies, yes. Helping residents develop vacant lots into community gardens, that's something that Isles has been doing for 40 years. And some of the most successful ones are still around. And those are because they're under community control and there's a capacity in that neighborhood with those people to manage a garden. So, we help them with some of the red tape, the navigating the issue with the lease or getting water access or some of the basic technical stuff like getting them plants and seeds and making sure that the soil is tested. But for the most part, we step out of the way and, they're the ones that are responsible for maintaining and managing those gardens. For every garden that we have helped start, again, there are others many that have failed because they do not have that built-in capacity to work within the community, or the residents themselves may not have the bandwidth to garden. It's not easy work, but that's one strategy that we found that has worked. So other ways that you can put lots back into community control would be through the Adopt a Lot program. So that's something that the city finally enacted this year with some guidance from us. And that was, one of the outcomes of vacant property surveys that we did in 2014 and 2019. So the city has right now close to 3,000 vacant lots, and they do not have the capacity to maintain all of them. So if there's an opportunity for residents or organizations that have the capacity to take ownership and take control, great. So, anytime that there's an official mechanism to allow that, I think that's good. One of the things I talked about yesterday, there are other municipalities. So, we're using best practices from around the nation to, figure out what works. So St. Louis and other cities have, St. Louis is called the mow to own program. So if residents agree to maintain a lot for a certain amount of time, and if the city is satisfied with their ability to do that, they will actually gain title of that property it's basically just a small administrative fee. So encouraging different, kind of creative uses like that to put it back under community control. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you, Jim. Jim, I know I asked you a lot of questions, so I'm going to be more direct with this one. Do you think that community control or institutional control, but with community intensive development of like a microforest, do you think that that's within the realm of possibility for residents to care for? Do you think people are interested in that? Just what do you think about that idea?
Well, from our experience, we started a Clean and Green program about 5 or 6 years ago, which was like a local workforce development program. So we found our own funding to hire a crew of people to maintain vacant lots in neighborhoods that we worked with. And, there were a good chunk of lots in East Trenton that we worked with the collaborative on. So there's a lot of kind of psychological issues with vacant lots too, other than just physical. So people are viewing these spaces, whether it's a vacant building or vacant land, as a site that, okay, that's a place where my family used to live, and those homes are no longer there because they were demolished, or there were issues with flooding, or there's this factory that shut down 50 years ago that's right across the street from my house that really symbolizes disinvestment, or that's the place where my parents or grandparents worked. So there's a lot of positive and negative associations with this as well. So and we have experimented with some kind of meadow or native sunflower planting, but then people see that, and you and I may see flowers or pollinator value, but residents may see overgrowth, or they may be kind of turned off because, if the lawn was neatly manicured, great. But now we've got this tall growth here that is harboring, what they may see as dangerous or unwelcome animals. So, one person's habitat is another person's, eyesore as well. So it has to be done carefully and done, to make sure that it's, clear what it is. So having signage, but then, as the other speaker said, working with the community to make sure that they're invested in it and that they have a hand in designing or maintaining or, using those educational opportunities that are there.
Thanks, Jim. I'm gonna ask if somebody who I'm not sure is in the audience is there. Lisa Sims, are you in the audience?
No.
No, Lisa's not there?
She was, but yeah.
Okay. That's
knew you were coming for
She did know I was coming for her. All right, I want to expand a little bit on what Jim talked about in terms of like people's relationship with what is nature and what is kind of like acceptable. So Caitlin, what is your sense of what residents who are active in East Trenton Collaborative find acceptable in terms of natural appearance and what they find unacceptable?
I laughed when Jim made that comment about, what to us might look like flowers to someone else looks like overgrowth, because just recently, I don't know if you heard this when you were there, Alex, but when we were doing the planning at George Page, one of our residents came over after we had done some planting and pointed at one of the plants that was in there and said, "That's a weed. That looks like a weed." And I was just tickled by that because we had just been there for several hours planting all of this and had discussed what was going to be planted at a community meeting. But that just goes to show, that you're going to have mixed feelings about really anything. I think when you're in a neighborhood, there are going to be some folks who, see one thing and see it one way and other folks who see it another. But I think that really speaks to the education piece, right? And the conversation piece about making sure that people understand and having, permanent or semi-permanent signage that explains what something is, and kind of being able to, in some ways, anticipate what someone might interpret from a space when looking at it, right? Because we have certain frameworks that we work from as far as what we conceptualize as a maintained space or as an intentional space. And I think, even just in, kind of Americana culture, right? Like a maintained space means a nice green, short, well manicured lawn, right? And when we're talking about these other kinds of natural spaces that are purposeful, right? I think it's really important to emphasize what the benefits and the purposes of those spaces are, and try to anticipate what some of the concerns would be. So I know for a lot of our residents, for example, the housing stock in East Trenton is extremely old, and we have a lot of houses that have, whose structural integrity is compromised to some extent, or who have houses that are next door to them whose structural integrity is compromised that is impacting their houses. And we have a lot of residents who have issues with critters, raccoons and mice and different bugs and birds and all types of things living in buildings, living in vacant lots. And so to a resident who is living next door or in the vicinity of something that's being maintained as a meadow, they may look at that as something that is going to, potentially increase the likelihood that they're going to be dealing with field mice or some other type of critter. And I think anticipating those kinds of concerns and being able to speak to them and provide information and education around, how to either prevent that or what's being done in order to make sure that that isn't a nuisance that accompanies these spaces for the people that are living in close proximity to them is really important to try to assuage some of those concerns so that people can buy into what the benefits are of those spaces, because oftentimes they're directly impacted by having mice in their house, whereas they're not necessarily in their from their framework, directly impacted by having increased pollinators in the neighborhood, right? Like there is a different value placed on those two things as far as how it directly impacts their day-to-day life. And so they don't care that this is going to bring more butterflies, because it's also going to bring mice in my kitchen, and I don't want that. So screw the butterflies, because I don't want the mice, right? And so when we have conversations about those types of things to help people get a better understanding of what they don't have to be concerned about, that they may be assuming that they have to be concerned about in relation to these spaces, that helps create the space for them to then be able to receive what the benefits of these spaces would be and buy into that. So I think, it's doubly important not only to emphasize what the benefits of spaces like this can be, because I think those tend to be more conceptual to the people living in these areas, as it is to talking about what their concerns are and speaking to those and addressing those and assuaging those to the extent that they can be.
Thank you, Caitlin. I want to ask you a question that I want to move to Leah. I think somebody asked in the chat, like, kind of why dumping happens and what are kind of like all the options for people to legally dump. So can you cover that very quickly?
What are the options for people to legally dump?
What are the options for people to legally dump, and why does illegal dumping happen?
Sure. Illegal dumping happens because people are poor. That's my short answer to that question. A lot of times, one of the main issues with situations like this is we have a lot of folks who in our area and surrounding areas who do handiwork, who do contracting work, because they are looking to utilize the skill sets that they have to support themselves and their families. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, depending on who you ask, right? There are a lot of parameters around how you can dispose of waste when you're doing certain kinds of jobs. So certain types of waste that you might have from a site where you're doing renovations on a house or doing some type of updates on a house, you cannot just put in the garbage. You have to take them to particular places, which may either be far away. Most, if not all of them, have a fee associated with them that you have to pay in order to be able to dispose of your waste. That a lot of times people are either unwilling or unable to pay, or trying to circumvent in order to maximize the amount of profit that they're able to make on some of these jobs because they need the money. A lot of times we have contractors who otherwise, legally should be having a dumpster to dispose of waste that's associated with projects that they're doing. But again, that costs a significant amount of money. And so if they can get away with, just taking their trash and loading it up into the back of a pickup truck and putting it somewhere where no one is going to see them putting it, then they can save, $500 to $1,000 that they now are able to use for whatever they need to use it for personally, right? So I think this is a much bigger issue. Outside of it, it is a nuisance to the neighborhood, right? But also there are systemic reasons why this happens that run much deeper than just people being irresponsible. And a lot of that is connected to poverty, frankly. And so, that's a much bigger conversation. And I don't think necessarily that's the case for everyone. Some people just are irresponsible and don't want to pay the fee or drive to the place or get the dumpster or do whatever it is that they're supposed to do. And for some people, it's a matter of, necessity to some degree to help support themselves and their families as best as they can. So it's a little bit of a double-edged issue. And when we're talking about it, I think we need to not only address, obviously figure out how to get people to, a lot of the answer oftentimes is prosecuting the people that are doing the illegal dumping, right? And yes, that's one way to approach the issue, but I think it is it's not a comprehensive way to approach the issue. And that conversation needs to include, how do we make these kinds of jobs more accessible to people who it is their primary source of income, right? And making sure that people can have businesses and things that are profitable to them, where they're able to support themselves and their families. So that's a much larger conversation, but I hope that answers your question to some degree.
You know, and I really like the way that you framed it. I actually hadn't thought about it that way. So that was cool. I'll talk to you about that later. It's 2:33. I have a question that I want to ask Leah, but I want to make sure that there's no questions from the audience, like about stuff that we haven't covered, that you want to ask about, or anything like that. So I just want to give a few seconds for anyone in the chat or someone to raise your hand to ask a question if you are interested in doing so.
And Alex, there was a question about what is the criteria that people need to meet or agree to for the Adopt a Lot program? I don't know if Jim's the best person to answer that. Or...
Yeah, Jim, do you know?
What was the question?
What's the, go ahead, Sophie.
What you mentioned, the Adopt a Lot program that was recently made available in Trenton. So what criteria do people need to meet in order to adopt a lot?
I think it has to be either adjacent to a dwelling that they own or occupy, or within, reasonable proximity. It has to be, I think, non-conforming, so under a certain size. So it's spelled out on the city's ordinance for that. But typically, like non-developable lots that have different size constraints.
Okay.
I think it's 1,300 square feet, if I'm not mistaken. Less than 1,300 square feet is considered an undersized lot.
Renata, you had a question?
Yeah, I was addressing the dumping issue. That was something that we contended with when we worked with the Trenton from the OEA. The
Outdoor Equity Alliance.
Outdoor Equity Alliance, I'm the coordinator. With the Trenton South Ward Neighborhood Association, headed by Tyrell Smith. We were, at the beginning of October, we were doing some work in their Adopt a Lot program. And one of the questions I had was, I know it's a lease thing. I was wondering, if they were able to purchase that, since it's not developed, is the idea to get them to actually be able to actually own and maintain that lot? And is this something that's viable for other people? And also to the dumping thing, one of the things I find interesting about what you were saying about dumping, when I lived in New York, one of the things I saw is it used to crack me up how I would see people litter in places like the Bronx and Brooklyn. But I had a white friend say to me, "Oh, we never litter in Manhattan. We all go out to the other boroughs for that." And I remember thinking to myself, having grown up out here, that I remembered people who would go, white people who would go and dump in Trenton because they didn't care. Trenton didn't care. So let's go ahead and go. It's already filthy and dirty there. We don't want that here, even though we also don't want to pay those fees. We don't want to mess up where we live, because the aesthetics of where you look matter to you and how you feel about them. So that is definitely part of that bigger conversation, which I think needs to happen in order to kind of get groups and neighborhoods to address these issues of dumping. It all has to do with ownership and responsibility that they are allowed to feel for that space. They're not always allowed to feel anything, but fortunate to have a place to live.
Thank you. You had a specific question about if the Adopt a Lot is supposed to lead to ownership as well?
Yeah, because, or is how the government can do. Yeah, fix this up, thanks.
Yeah.
We'll take that back. We'll take that off your hands now.
Jim or Caitlin, do either of you know if the Adopt a Lot program is intended or has a path to ownership?
There's no specific track for that. That would be an option for organizations or individuals that have the finances to do that. And that I don't want to say that's the only pathway to having land tenure there, but that is an issue for the Adopt a Lot program or the community gardening program. I think the maximum term that you can really be guaranteed to have access to that property is anywhere from 1 to 5 years. And, you know, especially if you're trying to invest sweat equity and energy into a garden, it's, you know, it's hard to, you really want to think longer term. So, you know, there are some of the larger, the legacy gardens in our network that fortunately have been preserved through the Green Acres program. And I believe Jay was instrumental in that process when he was at DEP. So, you know, I would like to see more gardens you know, have that tenured status, because it's, yeah, it's, again, it's hard to invest there, especially if there's no, you know, knowing that the city could reclaim the lot on short notice to develop it. You'd have to be ready to pack up and go at a moment's notice, and, you know.
Yeah, I don't think that's much of an incentive.
No.
Can I ask it? You discussed today and also yesterday, or mentioned the St. Louis program, Love at Home. That sounds just brilliant. Was that brought to the city of Trenton's attention? Did they consider it and reject it, or did no one even think about that in Trenton? It sounds, I'm sure that's saving St. Louis money, even as it's making for better communities. So I'm curious if that's.
I've suggested that to the city, and, you know, it's taken many years to get the Adopt a Lot ordinance put together and passed, and the community gardening ordinance passed. I've been working on, you know, those things for probably like 8 years or more, just to really kind of formalize the concept and make it clear that, you know, this is how it should operate.
Jay, you have your hand raised.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to just follow up with Jim's comment about the temporary nature of a lot of these things. And our organization, New Jersey Conservation Foundation, is getting ready to embark on some hopefully serious urban forestry efforts along streets, and looking for opportunities for microforests on small lots to create microforests in neighborhoods. And obviously, if you're going to create a forest, you're going to have permanence. So we're also working, like in the city of Camden, to encumber these properties in perpetuity, like we do any other piece of open space. So I'm hoping that maybe the city of Trenton will, if they haven't already, do some planning to look at lots that make most sense for these things, and then we can go through a process of making those lots permanent. I just saw there was a big auction announced of vacant lots this past week, and we need to take a look at that and look at the opportunities to green communities. But the reason I really wanted to come on is to ask Leah, like, one of the ideas that I've been looking at for a microforest idea is kind of the area of Mulberry Street where the old Scarpati was, and across the street where all those properties were purchased to get them out of the floodplain. And now it's all just mowed lawn, mostly with one row of trees. And it seems like it's a perfect opportunity to create a forest there. But I know there's contamination there, and I'm wondering, would a forest phytoremediation project work on that triangle right there at the corner of North Clinton and Mulberry Street?
So the corner at North Clinton and Mulberry Street, that's the former Scarpati site. We are in the process of developing the remedial action work plan. There is one section of PCDs that will be removed, but for the most part, it's not a heavily contaminated site. It isn't something that would be a candidate really for phytoremediation. We do have a designer, Brenton Perillo is developing a design for that park. It's just going to be sort of a passive area with hopefully space for some public art. But we are talking to Mercer County about doing pollinator gardens and some stream bank native shrub plantings within the floodplain of that site, which is the majority of the site is in the floodplain. The bigger site that you're talking about, the former Clinton Commerce and Scorsella site, we just received a grant to do remediation there, but the bulk of that site will be left intact And I think it probably would be it does have periodic flooding, but it would be probably a really good site for a microforest. I would love to talk to you guys more about that possibility.
So this is a great lead in to the whole reason that I wanted to do this stuff. If you are interested in working and advancing this idea, whether that be in the city of Trenton or elsewhere in New Jersey, we want to talk to you. I think that there are many people on this call who are kind of interested in exploring this idea and advancing it. So I don't know the best way to go about capturing your interest. Should my email go in the chat?
Yeah, we'll put your email in the chat, but I also think we could send a follow-up survey to
Yes.
the attendees to both of these sessions.
That's a good idea.
Asking if people would like to be involved in a follow-up meeting, follow-up work group.
Okay, cool. So if you are interested in hearing more about this idea, and not even necessarily in a work group, I think we talked informally about having webinars about more urban microforests and urban restoration in general. You know, shoot me an email, sign up for the Watershed Institute newsletter. Can you put my Mercer County
Yeah.
email in the chat?
Yeah.
All right, my Mercer County email is gonna go in the chat. Sign up for the Watershed Institute newsletter. You will receive a follow-up survey to see if you're interested in this. I want to thank everybody, my panelists, and those I called on who did not know they were going to be called on to talk. This was a really great conversation, both of the sessions. There is so much to follow up on and talk about. We're going to have webinars. We're going to do a lot of stuff around this. So thank you very much, everybody. And I hope to see all of you again related to this. Take care.
And
you, Alex.
thank you,
Yeah.
Alex. And if there's anybody here that would like to join our field trip